Okay. Well, good evening. It's good to see you. Yeah, it's good to be seen as well. Now, I really don't know what to make of tonight, and if I don't, it's quite possible that you won't either. You see, now, I'm a preacher. I spent my life preaching. I preached my first public sermon 54 years ago, and I spent my life doing it. But I do like this book that Jamie has chosen. There's some great stuff in it. And the subject I took a couple of weeks ago, I think, really tuned to everybody. The theme was consent. Particularly, it's talking about consent in the area of sexual politics. So that's sort of a real issue, a live issue, and something that we could take a lot from the Bible on. Now, tonight's which is the next chapter in the book, is a very different subject. It's called Enlightenment. And you may not feel very enlightened by the title. But what it's really about is busting the myth of the Dark Ages. Now, that means I've got a few minutes in which I have to say, A, show what the Dark Ages is, secondly, say what the myth is, and then thirdly, bust it. And that's a lot to do. And to be honest, it's because I'm simply doing as I've been asked and following the book. It's a history lesson. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not important. Actually, what I'm going to be speaking about tonight does affect so much of our evangelism. When I go door to door, knocking on doors to talk to people about Jesus, which not so much these days, but in times past I've done thousands of times, some of the issues here people often bring up. And one of them, which will kind of help us get into this, is they say, well, isn't Christianity all about violence? Hasn't the history of Christianity been violent? Aren't all wars started by religion anyway? And if you like, that in a sense is the part of the myth that we want to bust tonight. Because if people think that, they kind of say, I don't have to listen to anything you say about Christianity because I know that Christianity, is nonsense because science has shown it's nonsense. I know that it's destructive because history has proved it's destructive. There's no reason why I should want anything to do with Christianity. Now, we know, of course, that those things are not true. But we have to be able to help people past those things. So I'm going to take a little bit longer this evening. If I really see that this just isn't hitting the spot for you, then I'll cut it short. I don't mind that, really. But here we go then. Headline in a New Zealand newspaper in 2018. It really is medieval. In this day and age, it's shocking. Well, yeah, we hear things like that, don't we? And comment on an NHS website from a patient in 2024 about the car park at the Prince Albert Infirmary in Wigan. I'm sure it's a place you know well. It's like something out of the Dark Ages. You see, people use this language. It's positively medieval. It's like something out of the Dark Ages. And as I say, that second one was about a hospital car park in Wigan. And the first one was actually talking about mobile phone coverage in the North Island of New Zealand, away from Auckland in the more remote areas. And it's fascinating, isn't it, that to try to describe mobile phone coverage, the word medieval is used, and to define a car park, the word something out of the Dark Ages is used. Now, it's possible that the first person had actually done their dissertation on mobile phone coverage in Saxon England, though I doubt it. And it's possible that the second had written a thesis on hospital car parks in the reign of Henry II. Though, again, I somewhat doubt it. But the problem is these words get bandied around, and when it comes to Christianity, people who want to oppose opponents of Christianity use these words all the time. It's barbaric, it's archaic, it's like something from the Dark Ages, it's medieval. How can anybody in this day and age really take any of this seriously? So we have to say, what do these people mean, and does it matter? Well, I think what they mean is they use these phrases, Dark Ages and medieval. They use it to mean something or anything that is backward, broken, or brutal. I think those are kind of the key ideas behind saying that. Because in reality, everybody knows that there were not hospital car parks in the time of Henry II, and that the Anglo-Saxons did not have mobile phones. But it matters because of opponents of Christianity often use these terms in relation to Christianity in particular and religion in general. And it's a way of holding the whole thing at arm's length. I do not have to consider this. I can just cancel it out because everybody knows it's medieval. It's like something from the Dark Ages. So we do have to define what the Dark Ages really were. Both the terms Dark Ages and medieval, at one time they were used quite interchangeably. They're historical terms used in a technical way by professional historians, and to mean the same thing, although they tend not to use the phrase Dark Ages now. They would still use the term medieval. But they refer to a period roughly lasting 1,000 years. And that 1,000 years would be from the fall of the Western Roman Empire. I told you it was all about history tonight. Right up until the start of the Renaissance, which would be around the 14th, 15th centuries. Now, if you've never been a student of history, I don't know if those terms mean anything to you or not, and I apologize if they don't. But so we're talking about from about 500 AD, or CE if you prefer the way historians talk about it these days, from 500 to 1500. And basically, that 1,000 years has almost been written off in those phrases. Medieval just means Middle Ages, because they kind of really understood the classical period, through the Greeks and Romans up until about 500. And they thought they really understood what had happened from the Renaissance onwards with the rising culture and the arts and the revival, actually, of classical studies. And then the Enlightenment, which was kind of the scientific and philosophical revolution that followed that afterwards. But this kind of period in the middle, they sort of just wrote it off as the Dark Ages. And the writer of this book, and here I'm going to quote him, says, "When I think of the Middle Ages, I imagine battles, boils, and bubonic plague." And if you think about it, that's probably pretty much, if you think about that time at all, that's probably, it's probably because of the way you were taught history at school. It was all the battles, wasn't it? We know about those. We know everybody went around with awful boils covering their bodies, and the bubonic plague that sort of wiped out whole areas of Europe. So that's the writer says that's. Hi. I see you've introduced yourself. Yeah. But that actually is at best a lopsided assessment of the age that brought us Magna Carta, which is actually the foundation of the whole unwritten constitution of our country and became the basis of the constitution for many countries around the world. It's the time that gave us universities. How you can call Dark Ages the period when, across Europe, particularly in Britain, universities were being founded, because they were. Oxford University, nobody really knows the exact date, but they had teaching there from about the 11th century onwards, and it was under Henry II in the 12th century when it was really established and developed as a university, and Cambridge came along not very much behind it. And also he says Chartres Cathedral, some of the most magnificent architecture in the world. So it's quite strange really that we call it the Dark Ages when no period before and possibly since in some ways has given us so much. And we could add to that spectacles. These were invented in the so-called Dark Ages. Mechanical clocks, the ability to tell the time accurately, were invented in that time. Windmills, great technological innovation. And the civil service. I don't know if you know that Henry II is generally regarded as having instituted the whole system of civil government that we have in Britain now. Now, to be careful, you see, history is a bit of a hobby of mine, and I have to be careful not to chuck too much at you. Does the phrase throwing shade mean anything to you? Throwing shade, it's a slang term. Well, again, to come back to Scrivener, he describes it like this: a perfect description of what we've been doing for centuries. We look back at the Middle Ages as benighted and see ourselves as enlightened. Throwing shade means to cast a shadow over, to dismiss, to rubbish something particularly from the path. And there's a guy called Carl Sagan who the second half of the last century was a kind of popularizer of science. Has anybody heard of him? One or two you have. Does the name Professor Brian Cox mean anything to you? Okay, well, he was kind of the Professor Brian Cox of my youth. Okay, he had that same position, the scientific broadcaster that popularized science and did television series that kind of took science to the masses, the people who watched television but didn't actually ever read a scientific book of any kind. Now, in the late 20th century, he had a television series called Cosmos, and it really was a groundbreaking one. And in this Cosmos, he did a whole history of the development of science. And up to the year 400, he listed inventions and people and discoveries and said, in the classical ancient world, they did this, and this. He then had nothing at all in the next 1,000 years, despite the things I've just mentioned to you. Then in 1400, he started again, and with people and things that had come. So as far as he was concerned, Dark Ages, they might as well have never happened. It's as though somebody pressed the pause button and on humanity, and nothing happened that was of any value. But he actually went further than that, because he saw it as a millennium gap, a poignant lost opportunity for the human species. In other words, humans have been great at developing through most of history, but they took 1,000 years off. And he actually went further, not in that series, but in things that he wrote. He actually blamed Christianity for that. He reckoned that was the period when Christianity dominated everything in Europe, so it just shut down everything else and sent sort of humanity back into the darkness for 1,000 years. So the Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries brought a rediscovery of classical learning, and were followed by the scientists of the 16th and 17th centuries. And it was largely talked about that a new age of reason would emerge that would replace faith altogether. Faith was all about superstition, and reason would sweep faith off the map. And you've probably heard of Thomas Paine and The Age of Reason. One or two who have. Well, if you haven't read it, go to the library. He published this in 3 parts from 1794 to 1807. And it really is actually, in the Western world, one of the most important series of books ever written, on which a huge amount of Western culture has been based. And he contrasted the rationality of his time with the earlier age of faith, which he also equated with superstition and ignorance. He said this: "The age of ignorance commenced with a Christian system. It was a long interval of science, a vast chasm of many hundreds of years, a vast sandy desert in which no shrub appeared." So that was Thomas Paine's view of Christianity. And so much of sort of modern Western thinking has really come out of that whole age of reason thinking. And this matters because in some ways this is the background that, particularly if you're working in the universities, this is the background really that is behind the thinking that so many people have when it comes to Christianity. Now, of course, it's not unusual for the current generation to feel itself superior to what went before. Now, you probably think your parents were idiots and that you know everything. I thought that of my parents. My kids now think it of me. And in a few years' time, my granddaughter will think of her mother in the same way. So, yeah, it's quite natural in some ways to think that we are the ones that suddenly know everything. And the dark ages of when my dad was a teenager is sort of kind of a vast sandy desert with no shrub appearing in it. So there's a kind of human thing going on here. But this actually took hold in many, many levels of academia. Okay, well, that's kind of the historical background, and I hope that didn't try your patience too much. So how do we kind of restore the reputation of the Dark Ages? And again, why does it matter? To come back to Glenn Scrivener, he says this: "The medieval period saw great advances in education, philosophy, theology, law, politics, literature, art, music, architecture, commerce, and technology. This period laid crucial foundations for development, such as science, freedom, and progress." And so the period that kind of produced all of that somehow gets written off as Dark Ages, and even worse, gets written off as this is what happens if Christians get in charge. Everything value shuts down, and it's just this vast desert. So really, the restoring the reputation of the Dark Ages wouldn't matter if it wasn't an important part of restoring the reputation of Christianity. You see, when I knocked on people's doors and they said to me things like, "Oh, well, all wars are started by religion." Now, I always used to say to them, "That's a very interesting idea, explain it to me." Of course, they never could. And if I said to them, "Name one," they would say, "Well, the Crusades." I say, "Interesting. You have to go back nearly 10 centuries to find an example." Okay, that's right, name another one. And of course, they never can. But once people have kind of got this thinking in their mind, it just puts a shutter up. That means that anything we try to say about Jesus and Christianity is not going to get listened to, because they know these are the people that have started every war in history. Although, as I say, when I ask them to explain their theory to me, they never can, because they just picked it up. It was just a convenient excuse not to listen to Christians. So is it actually true that the 1,000 years of the medieval period were dark and brutal, and that Christianity was the cause? Well, sorry, a bit more history here. There will not be a test. You will not have to come back correctly with all the dates before you're allowed to go home tonight. Now, you won't be kept in after school if you don't remember every date absolutely correctly. By the year 300, Christians in the Roman Empire numbered more than 6 million. That's amazing. In a day when there were not mobile phones or other rapid means of communication, from a handful of disciples of Jesus in a room in Jerusalem, a tenth of the whole of the Roman Empire, 6 million people had converted to Christianity. And we are actually talking about conversion here. We're not talking about some king saying, "Right, I rule 20,000 people, I'm a Christian, so now you will all be Christians. It wasn't that kind of edict. This was just through the spread of the gospel all across the empire, in all its corners. 6 million people would come to Christ. Remarkable. And they had grown actually by entirely peaceful means. They were the ones who were persecuted. They were not the persecutors. They were not powerful people. If you were here at the last one I did, where we did talk again a bit about the Romans, because he seems to like the Romans, what the Romans did for us. The Christianity totally challenged the culture of every part of the Roman Empire, and without any authority, without any official power, without influence, and often against the persecution of the authorities, they grew to a church of 6 million people. So when Emperor Constantine was converted, which is 312 AD, now sometimes that's portrayed that he, this great conqueror, got this message from God, conquer by the sign of the cross, and therefore he then went and by the sword imposed Christianity all across his empire. That's not the way it was. He was actually following the tide of history, not leading it. And whilst he did become a Christian, and his mother seems to have been a genuine Christian, this isn't really what caused Christianity to spread. And in some ways, many of us, and certainly I think, it would have been far better if he hadn't. But it was actually about 70 years later that the Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But by that time, just through the spread of the gospel, half the empire had been converted. So this idea that Christianity has always been some sort of bloodthirsty group that goes and threatens to murder people unless they give up their old ways and become Christians, there just is no basis for it there in history. Now, world-changing event, we'll be very quick on this bit. 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome. It started the process of the collapse of the Roman Empire. About 60 years later, the Vandals. Vandals are not a new invention, by the way. It was the Vandals that brought about the final demise of the Western Roman Empire. The eastern part, which became known as the Byzantine Empire, that actually went on for many hundreds of years further. But the Western Roman Empire totally collapsed during that period, which left to a huge vacuum, power vacuum, in the whole of Western Europe. So as Rome's power and influence declined, a new vision was needed and was found. It came with Christianity, and one thinker in particular. Have any of you ever heard of Augustine of Hippo? Does that name mean anything to you? Yep, I see a few of you have, yes. This is nothing to do with hippopotamuses. He was actually a North African bishop. And do you know the name of the book he wrote? Anybody know that? It was called The City of God. And this was probably one of the most influential books ever written in history. And in this book, he set out the true nature of Christianity as a spiritual kingdom headed by Christ, as it being entirely separate from temporal power, which was really a revolutionary idea, because in the ancient world, religion and power did always go together. It's probably why people think that Christianity is like that, because most of history, religion has been like that. And we now talk about the separation of church and state. That's an ideal that has been taken up by many, many states all across the world. And certainly those who've brought in modern constitutions, like the United States of America a mere 230 years ago, and many others since. They've written into their constitutions separation of church and state. That all came from Augustine in writing this book in North Africa, And the ideas of that spread all through the whole of Western Europe. And the church continued to grow, but again as a peaceful spiritual kingdom. And the growth went on for centuries. So if we ask, has Christianity actually spread by threat or by persuasion? It is persuasion. Christianity has been a missionary faith from the very beginning. And it sought influence through persuasion, not power through force. In fact, the problems in Christianity have come when people have tried to put those two things back together. The political power and spiritual power. So another Augustine, who was a prior in a monastery in Rome, was sent by Pope Gregory to convert the Anglo-Saxons. That's southern England. That's the part of the country I'm from. So my forebears. He became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was so effective in evangelizing England that less than a century later, missionaries were going out from England, taking the gospel all over the world. But again, all of this was done purely through prayer, preaching. Never was there political power in it. So where did it all go wrong? Well, you've heard of Charlemagne, I guess. Yeah, that name means something to you. Charlemagne, 742 to 814. Again, not a test. He was a Frankish king, Charles the Great, and he sought to re-establish the lost empire of Rome. He saw himself as he wanted to be the new Roman Empire, the new Roman emperor. In fact, he called himself the Holy Roman Emperor. He established through force a Holy Roman Empire, covering much of the former Roman Empire in Western Europe. But he did it through force and tried to impose all the ideas of Christianity, or at least his ideas of Christianity, not Jesus' ideas of Christianity. And this really is where things began to go wrong. But it's as late as the 8th and 9th centuries. So as he expanded his empire, he went to the Saxons, no, not the Anglo-Saxons, that's southern England, the Saxons in Germany, Lower Saxony, so these were German people. And the Saxons in England, of course, came from Germany originally. When the Saxons stood out against him and didn't want to be part of his empire, he ordered 4,500 to be beheaded in a single day. It's known as the Massacre of Verdun, and it took place in 782. And because he brought the two things together, Christianity really, for the first time in its history of 800 years, was seen as something violent and extended by violence. But he was like others who came after him. He did not do what he did because he was a Christian. He did what he did because he wanted to, but used some of the language and ideas of Christianity to back himself up. In the way that in no sense could you call the Second World War that was started by Hitler a war started by Christians. Now, Hitler used Christian rhetoric. Now, his hatred for the Jews, whatever it stemmed from, he of course referred to them as Christ killers. And so it's kind of set Christianity against the Jews. But it was his nationalistic ideas and his empirical ambitions that caused that. But he used the language, the rhetoric of Christianity to try to give himself the right to do the things that he did. So he tried to justify his anti-Semitism by going, well, they killed Christ, we in the West are Christians, therefore they're our enemies, was the kind of thinking. So whenever Christianity has been used, it's never been Christianity that kind of wanted this. This never came from Christian ideas. It was always people who were entirely un-Christian in their whole makeup, who used and abused Christianity. And at the time, the Christian contemporaries, going back here to Charlemagne, Christian contemporaries denounced it. Alcuin of York, Bishop of York, said, "A person may be drawn into faith, not forced into it. We must follow the example of the apostles and the preachers, not the plunderers." And the church's official position on this was always clear. And in the 12th century, the whole church in Western Europe forbade the use of all harsh means and compulsion in converting people to Christianity. It went back to this complete separation of church and state. So that leaves the question, well, then what about the Crusades? We could also say, what about the Spanish Inquisition? I'm not going to go into that. Nobody expects a Spanish Inquisition. Any Monty Python fans? No, clearly not. You are, yes. Nobody expects a Spanish Inquisition. I can see Terry Jones saying it now. So we're not going to go into the Spanish Inquisition, and we're going to touch very lightly on the Crusades. Now, there are different views about the Crusades, and there's no time to go into those here. There are people, historians and Christian historians, who have tried to kind of exonerate completely the Christians involved. I don't really think that's possible. It is a terrible stain on the history of Christianity. But it isn't, and it never was, what most people think was actually going on. But let's take the worst view, because I think as Christians we should take the worst view of ourselves rather than the best, and view them as a serious blot on the history of Christianity and how far Christianity strays when it uses the weapons of this world. Because Paul told us the weapons of our warfare are not carnal but spiritual, having divine power to tear down strongholds. When Christianity takes up the weapons of the world, it's always a disaster. Now again, I'm going to quote Scrivener. Islam had spread unapologetically by wars of conquest since its inception. No historian disagrees with that. Islam has always been a militant faith and quite prepared to use brutal militant means to spread. And that's just an accepted fact of history. And it had actually held Jerusalem from 637 AD CE. So when the Crusades began in the early 11th century, that situation had been a long time. But after 4.5 centuries, the losses of the Byzantine Empire, which is the former eastern side of the Roman Empire, after centuries of losses, the Byzantine emperor pleaded for help from Christians in Western Europe against a resurgent Muslim foe that quite seriously was setting out to wipe out the whole of Christianity in the East and establish an Islamic empire. Now, I'm not saying that justifies what the Christians did. I don't think it does. Taking up arms against them, I don't think was the way. So, after a surprising victory in retaking Jerusalem, the Crusades were largely embarrassing failures. There were 5 or 6 separate ones lasting over a period of more than 100 years, quite a bit more than 100 years. They were largely embarrassing failures. And Muslims do not tend to see anything wrong in the fact that Christianity tried to use force because that's the way it did it itself. It just laughed because it saw how bad Christianity was at doing it. And again, when we look at the people who got involved, do you have any mental picture of Richard the Lionheart, Richard the First of England? If you've watched any of the Robin Hood films, generally, there's one of them, isn't it? Sean Connery pops up at the end as Richard the First, isn't it? A very Scottish English king. But then Richard the First wasn't really an English king. He was actually French. He didn't speak English. He only spent 6 months of his life in England. And his main reason for getting involved in the Crusades was not some high Christian ideal. He wanted an alliance with the King of Spain, and the King of Spain promised him an alliance through marriage with this very powerful Spanish king if he would join in the Crusades and go with him to the Middle East. So again, it was a purely political move by a king, but all done in the name of Christ and Christianity. Now, there is no doubt that the Crusaders committed atrocities in the name of Christ. The point is that it was done against the tide of historical Christianity and not with it. After all, if I come over here and punch one of you in the face and say, George told me to do that, and then I punch you again and say, this is what George wants, and I'm going to keep beating you until you do what George tells you, well, you can't really, you have to get to know George and find out whether he did actually. No, he didn't. You have to find out whether George actually did want me to do that or not. You see the difference I'm trying to draw here. The fact that some people have used and abused Christianity to justify what they do does not in any way tell us anything about Christianity, any way that me punching you, and I won't because you're bigger than me, or tall, and probably not around the middle, it just doesn't have anything to do with it. Me doing that actually tells you nothing about George. But perhaps if I said it to enough people, they'd say, wow, I hope I never meet George. He must be a pretty terrible person. The best thing we can do is get rid of George. You see what I mean? And that's really what has happened to Christianity. I should have used that illustration in the first place and forgotten the history, shouldn't I? So the Crusades, again, quoting Glenn, the Crusades were appallingly corrupt. But once again, we must ask, when judged against what? Because the answer, not surprisingly, is when judged against Christianity. You see, the main point of this book is that what most of the opponents to Christianity in our country don't understand is that all the ideas they hold that make them criticize what they think Christianity is actually come from Christianity. Because, in many parts of the world, the idea of religion going to war, well, of course that's what religion does. That's what you would do. And if any religion is any good, it's worth fighting and dying for. So the ideas that people are, in a sense, using to criticize Christianity really come from Christianity itself. The idea of tolerance and forbearance and the value of the individual and the right to freedom. All these things actually came into our history from Christianity. They weren't there in the Greek classical world, in the Roman classical world. They came into that world through Christianity. And because people have been given such a distorted view of Christianity, especially in that 1,000-year period, they kind of write off Christianity. Conclusion, that's a wonderful word, isn't it? Did I say that out loud? So I didn't set the subject. I hope I really haven't worried you too much. And if it's not useful to you, you can forget it. So this is not the time to go into all the advances of the medieval period in terms of technology, human rights, universities, parliaments, and all the stuff that came through the Reformation. I think that might come up later in the book anyway. But concluding this chapter, he says this. This is the fourth quote from him, I think. Just 10 minutes spent in York Minster, which was completed in 1472, should dispel the myth of the Dark Ages. Right. Now, again, we have to ask, does this matter? Well, I think it does. Because a lot of the people that we're trying to witness to, without understanding any of the stuff I've talked about, they've grabbed these ideas that Christianity is barbaric, is brutal, has caused masses of wars, held up the development of society, held back the development of science. Now, maybe one of the other talks at some other point we can go actually into the fact that most of the advances that people think Christianity held up actually came from Christianity. I'll give you one example, education. The idea that everyone should receive education in our country came only from Christianity. Nearly every school, college or university began as a Christian institution started not by the state or the local authorities, but started by Christians. Our hospitals all have their foundation in the hospitality, that's why they're called hospitals, the hospitality of the monasteries. That anyone who was sick or in need could go and be cared for. And in the monastery there was a hospitaller who ran the hospital. And we have hospitals today with dodgy car parks. So this idea that somehow Christians held everything back, history actually gives you precisely the opposite picture. Christianity really has been the light that Christ meant it to be in a dark world, and began all these things when nobody else was really very interested in them. Okay, well, tonight's been longer than usual because, to be honest, I don't know how I could have done that in less time than I have. And if it's wearied you, I apologise. Don't kick me. I didn't write the book. Don't kick Jamie even though he chose it. Don't punch him and tell him George told you to do it. Because George didn't. George is not like that. He's actually a really nice guy. You see how hard it is to dispel myths, once they take root? Now, it's actually 7:30. There were some questions coming out of this. Do you want to discuss them in a group, or do you just want to... Well, give me 3 options. You can discuss them in a group and come back to me. You can just raise a couple of questions now, or you can just say thank you and good night, and we'll pray and go home. And I really don't mind which, and I will not be offended, whichever one you choose. Is there anything you're burning to ask or comment about out of it?
I suppose for me, more than hearing people say, "Oh, it's progressive." Is it right?
It is, yes. In fact, one of the questions I have... Oh, the questions...
Yeah, that's why I said that.
Yes.
Yeah, so instead of people saying that, a lot of people are like, "Oh, the church has just been used as like a money, like to take money from people, and that's why it's such a rich institution." And I suppose they might fire that back if you said, "Oh, well, they started hospitals and this and that." People could say, "Yeah, that's just because they took the money off the people and had the chance to do it." So it's just like, what would you say?
Well, often it has. And the which I wasn't trying to go into the excesses of the church in the medieval period, which was, of course, the Roman Catholic Church. There was only one church through the whole of Western Europe at that time, the Roman Catholic Church, so based in Rome, and really the continuation of Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire. It kept a lot of those ideas. And it was in many ways very abusive. And it did serve the rich and the powerful, and we just have to admit that. Yeah, because it did. But only to the extent that it moved away from the teachings of Christ, because you did not find the gospel. The whole reason that the Reformation came along in the 14th and 15th centuries was that the Christian, so-called Christian church at the time had pretty much ceased to be Christian altogether. And it was, when a certain monk, a German monk in Wittenberg, posted 95 theses in Latin on a church door. Now that doesn't sound much like the way to start a revolution, does it? 95 points. Be like Keir Starmer, get it down to 5, But 95 points in Latin on basically a notice board on church premises. But that actually started what we call the Reformation, which is when people went right back to the Bible to rediscover the gospel and to preach the gospel throughout it. So there was a Reformation, and it was needed. So again, it's what happens when the church gets power. And the reason I think it happens is fairly understandable. Powerful people see the opportunity. But last time when we were talking about consent, one of the things we were talking about was child sexual abuse. Of course, there have been child sexual abuse scandals in the church. Not because anything Jesus said or real Christians say or do would lead you to child abuse. But a child abuser will say, if I get into the church, I can get to kids. And perhaps the problem with when church institutions become powerful, ambitious people get to the top. You see, and there were many of them, even in those times, the many ordinary, godly priests in parishes who, despite having been given very little to do it with, because they weren't taught the Bible, even the priests weren't taught the Bible then, they genuinely tried to serve God and love people. But the ambitious people, of course, get to the top because they want promotion. They're not going to stay in a village and just look after sick people. No, they want to they want to be a bishop. They want to get to the top. So the more powerful the church becomes as an organisation, the more likely it'll go off the rails. And that's really why we see that nearly all of our denominations which started with the gospel actually end up going far from it. Now, why does free Methodism exist? Well, because Methodism got away from its roots. But why did Methodism exist? Because Anglicanism got away from its roots. And people like Wesley was, I don't know if you know this, an ordained clergyman of the Church of England. He said near the end of his life, I have lived and I die, a true son of the Church of England. But it wasn't possible to do his gospel ministry. I was pastoring a church in Herefordshire, and when John Wesley came to that town, it was one of the oldest Baptist churches in the country since 1656, so the history is all tied up. But when he came to that town, the vicar of the parish wouldn't let him preach in the church, so Wesley went out and stood on a tombstone to preach. The vicar got the organist in to play the organ as loudly as possible, got the bell ringers in to ring all the bells to drown out Wesley, so he went down into the public square and preached there instead. So, because the church was just a powerful institution that wasn't interested in the gospel, Wesley had to start Methodism. But as time goes on, so much of Methodism has moved so far from the gospel that Free Methodists began to say, we can't stay in this. We have to kind of start again. Which is why we are never called to speak for, stand up for, or defend the historic institutions of the church. We are disciples of Jesus. And we have to focus on the person of Jesus. Because the history of the church is terrible. But in reality, only in isolation. The vast history of the church is actually very Christ-like. It's just that that's not the bit that people really want to talk about. But I think when we're witnessing to people, we have to be honest. I'm never going to pretend that the church hasn't done the things that it's done. What I am going to say is that it wasn't Christian. And the fact that when I first left school, I worked for Midland Bank. One of the first things they did was they showed us lots of counterfeit £1, we had £1 notes then, £1, £5 and £10 notes. And the whole idea was that we had to be able to recognise the counterfeit. But there's only a counterfeit because there's a reality. And we need to be sure that we only took in or gave out the genuine article. And I think the same way we as Christians, we say, yeah, sure, counterfeit Christianity has existed all over the world, at different times, different places, different ways, different people. And we can't stop that. What we can do is bring you the genuine article.
Why did you approve of Simpson?
Why did I approve of him?
Oh, you mentioned something.
Well, yeah, it's not really for me to approve of him or not. I'm not sure how genuinely Christian he was. I think his mother, Saint Helena, probably was a genuine Christian. And she certainly influenced him. I'm not sure I totally buy his vision. He may have had a vision from God saying, conquer by the sign of this cross, but, is Jesus really good? He was kind of a forerunner of the Crusaders. In fact, the Crusaders kind of looked back to Constantine. Now, it wasn't that he did a lot that was especially bad and brutal. He didn't do the kind of things that Charlemagne did. But there's no doubt that he did try to force through politically conversion to Christianity. And I actually think that Christianity was better when it had no power except the power of the gospel. And I think a lot of the troubles, especially the troubles of the Middle Ages, stem from the fact that Christianity became the official religion of Rome. But it got all kind of mixed up with the paganism of Rome. In Portugal, I went into a fairly ordinary Roman Catholic church. If you knew nothing about it and you just walked in and looked at it, you'd assume that the most important deity was female, because it's statues and pictures of Mary everywhere with crowns on her head. Jesus is either a baby in her arms or he's dying on a cross. He's not portrayed. She's portrayed as the Queen of Heaven. He's not portrayed as the King of Heaven. So because there were female deities in Rome, and when they became Christian, all the people that liked female deities, they kind of almost had to come up with one. So you see the kind of thing I mean. When Christianity and temporal power get together, it nearly always results in Christianity ceasing to be Christianity. I was in a meeting once when a bishop that I knew quite well said, do not listen to those stupid people who are for the disestablishment of the church. Do not listen to them. And at the end there was an open question time, and as I did know him quite well, I said, Gavin, I'd like to thank you for two things. I'd like to thank you for a talk today. It was mostly excellent. And I'd like to thank you for calling me stupid. He said, Derek, I would never call you stupid. I said, I'm sorry you did. He said, when? I said, you said, do not listen to those stupid people that will be for the disestablishment of the church. I think that when you mix the two up, temporal power and spiritual power, the temporal power, the political power, tends to win out. So I'm all for the purity of the gospel, and the weapons of our warfare are not carnal but spiritual, having divine power to tear down strongholds. The sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and pray in the Spirit with all prayer and supplications. That's the only two weapons I ever want the church to use.
I'll probably say, like, when you see people who have the strongest faith often come from places where Christianity is completely outlawed. You see, like China and Vietnam, Christianity comes from there.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. I've met quite a lot of Chinese Christians who have been under persecution. And in fact, in the first 3 centuries, when Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire, it grew. Well, they reckon that it grew at something like I think 40% a decade, about 3 or 4% a year. Maybe fairly modest in some ways, but over time, that is huge growth. And in some ways, the problems began with becoming the official religion of Rome, and people then get into it for all the wrong reasons and change it away from what it is, and often it is under persecution. Let me tell you one thing. You may not know this about China, but before China was shut down and all the missionaries were thrown out, the missionaries tended to just go and live on the coast. They lived very Western lifestyles. They took their butlers with them and things, and they kind of lived as a Western outpost on the coast of China, and they were really making very little impact in China at all. When everything was closed down, and of course there were and there still is persecution of Christians in China. It is reckoned now that there are something like 200 million Christians in China. In fact, one of the key things, one of the worst people in history, and in fact the person who's been guilty of the deaths of most people, was Mao Zedong. And by the way, if people talk to you about religion starting wars, you can say to them, well, you do know the biggest killer in history was an atheist. Now, do you expect me to accept responsibility for wrong things that people have done in the name of Christ? Will you accept responsibility for Mao Zedong? You're an atheist. He was officially an atheist. Communism is atheistic. He killed more people, and all his own people, than any person in ever history. In fact, the top two are both communists, atheists, Mao Zedong and Stalin. The next was certainly not a Christian. It was Genghis Khan, and the next is Adolf Hitler. None of whom could remotely be said to be Christian in any meaningful sense of the word. So how come it's religion that starts all the wars, if these people have been responsible for more deaths than anyone else in history? You see, we have to combat these ideas with kind of hard facts. Well, do you know, the person who did most for the gospel in China was Mao Zedong. He would hate it to be true, but he did a couple of things he did. One was that he united the whole of the Chinese empire, which was really many, many different nationalities and countries, really, into one China. But the other thing he did was insist that they all learn one language, Mandarin, and became the official language of the whole of China. It was like Europe before, collection of different countries and different languages. And then the third thing he did was he gave everyone a shortwave radio so that he could broadcast his speeches to them. And his whole idea was that his political atheism would take over the country, and everyone would have to follow him, and he'd brainwash the whole nation into following him. Transworld Radio built a huge transmitter in the Seychelles and just broadcast the gospel to China for decades. And on those shortwave radios, people turned off Mao Zedong, tuned in Transworld Radio, heard the gospel, were converted, began churches in their homes. And if Mao Zedong had never come along, history does not suggest there'll be anything like the number of Christians in China there are today. So you see, God has a wonderful, we sing hymns like God is working his purpose out as year succeeds to year. As a young Christian, we were all praying for the downfall of Mao Zedong. His ideas. When I was at school, loads of boys in my school carried the thoughts of Chairman Mao, his little red book, in their pockets. You'd find more of those than people like me who had New Testaments in our pockets. How his ideas seem to be taking over the world. But the gospel actually triumphed. I imagine the kind of the smiles in heaven when Mao Zedong said, everyone's going to learn Mandarin. Yes. Everyone's going to have a shortwave radio. Yes. Gospel. So the history is, you can probably go, I find history fascinating. Not everybody does, I know. But Charles Spurgeon, the great Baptist preacher, said those who've learned to see God's hand in history have learned a good lesson. And I think that what we can take from history is that whatever the world does, and however much they think they've come up with a way of getting rid of Christianity, which has been tried ever since it started. Today, 1/10 of believers in the world face some sort of restriction and persecution. All through history they wanted to wipe out Christianity. It will still be the truth that triumphs when Jesus Christ returns, and the whole church, living and dead, is gathered up to be with him forever, when all these other political ideologies will be consigned to the dustbin of history. It's time we stopped. I really appreciate your patience tonight. I'm sorry if I've tried it. It's not a subject I would have selected. And Skylar actually is very glad because he dodged a bullet. It was actually to have been him tonight. It's not that he cried off, he didn't, he was willing to do it, but because of other circumstances, this was meant to have been, this subject was 2 weeks ago, but because the World Cup final was on and England were in it, we thought we'd get even less than we got tonight. So Jamie and I agreed to postpone it. So which meant that it would have been Skylar. But Jamie said, well, if Derek's already planning to do it, we'll let him. So hopefully, I haven't looked at next time's subject, but I hope it's something a bit easier to grapple with. But thank you for your patience, for your understanding. I think we should just pray together and go home. And be nice to George on the way out. Father, we want to thank you. It seems amazing, really, in the short time we've been together this evening, we've wandered through more than 20 centuries of history, and we've wandered all over the globe. But all that we've been trying to do is to understand you and your ways, to try to be sure that we are true to you and to your ways, that we really are Christ's people and Christ-like people, that we really are gospel-centered people, that we understand perhaps a bit more how to share you with the people around us. But Father, we don't believe for a moment that any clever argument of ours or any historical fact is going to bring anyone to their knees to say Jesus Christ is Lord. Father, we know that faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the preaching of Christ. But Father, we do pray that through our wisdom and understanding, we might be able to help people to come to a place where they are ready to consider Jesus, and maybe ready even to trust and follow him. And Father, we thank you that we are absolutely certain that you will fulfill all your perfect purposes in Christ. And because of your great grace and your wonderful mercy and love to us, on that day when all your people are on their faces before the throne, by your great love and mercy and grace, we shall be there, even us. We will be there, glorifying Christ forever. We want to comfort one another with these words, and we want to glorify you, and we bring you our thanks and our praise, Father, in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.